Okay. All right. Yeah, people are just coming in right now, so we'll just give everyone just a few more seconds before we get started. All right. Well, I think I'm going to go ahead and get started because we are up at 5:31. So just being very mindful of everybody's time. So we're going to get started. And I just want to first of all say good evening to everyone. Welcome to our speaker series tonight. Thank you for joining us. We are featuring Mr. Knox Thames, visiting fellow at the U.S. Institute of Peace, on the topic of protecting religious freedom in the time of COVID and conflict. Our program tonight is part of the World Affairs Councils of America and U.S. Institute of Peace Engage America Speaker Series. My name is Xiaoyin Zhao. I am the Executive Director of the World Affairs Council of Kentucky and Southern Indiana. We are a hub for international exchange, dialogue, and learning located in Louisville, Kentucky. And as a member of 3 national networks, the Global Ties US, the World Affairs Councils of America, and Sister Cities International, our organization facilitates a variety of international, professional, and youth exchanges, speaker programs, and educational opportunities for this area throughout the year. Our organization, World Affairs Council, is a member-supported organization, but we are not member exclusive in our programs, which are open to the public. We are here to ensure that you can continue to access expert analysis and quality discussions on topics that impact us locally, nationally, and internationally, especially during this pandemic. So our program today, as we said, is with Mr. Knox Thames, who will explore the issue of how we protect religious freedom, especially religious minorities, during this tumultuous time. Moderating our discussion tonight is Judd Hendricks, Executive Director of the Interfaith Paths to Peace, which is a valued community organization in Louisville and a partner for the World Affairs Council. So welcome to both of you. And before I turn it over to Judd to introduce our speaker tonight, I want to just give everybody a very quick reminder about our run of show. This webinar is recorded and it is live streamed on Facebook. WAC members will have access to the recording of this program. We will have up about 30 minutes of moderated conversation, followed by a moderated Q&A for another 30 minutes. And some of this may include the questions that you may have submitted ahead of time. But please note that you can submit a question at any time during this program in the Q&A box, and they will be answered as time allows. And please feel free to use the chat box for your comments. And now I will go ahead and turn it over to Judd to start us. Judd, over to you.
Great, thanks so much. And so appreciative of all the work that the World Affairs Council does in our community, especially the speaker series where you really resource wonderful speakers. And Knox Thames is one of those. So a deep bow to the World Affairs Council in your work here in our community. And I'm honored and excited to represent Interfaith Paths to Peace, which works in similar areas with religious freedom and peacemaking, and honored to moderate the conversation. I do want to encourage you as we begin to think about a question that you would like to ask Knox as he speaks, and see if we can bring the conversation down from kind of a global perspective. And there are a lot of issues going on in our own state right now with freedom and COVID. So I hope you will use the chat box to ask some questions. We do want to, again, thank Knox Thames for being with us. He is a visiting expert with the United States Institute of Peace and a former special advisor for religious minorities in the Near East and South Central Asia at the U.S. Department of State. He is also a Kentuckian who is from Richmond originally, also did his bachelor's work from Georgetown College, He joined the United States Institute of Peace 20 years ago, and he also included in the State Department at 2 different U.S. government foreign policy commissions. And we want to welcome him back to Kentucky, even though that's virtual. He did his degree at Georgetown College and has a Juris Doctorate from American University's Washington College of Law and a master's in international affairs from the School of International Service at American University. So as you can see, Knox is well prepared and informed to lead in our discussion today. So Knox, I want to turn it over to you. And again, welcome back to Kentucky virtually, and thanks for all the work that you're doing. And we look forward to hearing your presentation and then having some dialogue. Thank you.
Great. Well, thank you very much. It's a great pleasure to be with everyone this evening. I want to start with this idea that religion is powerful. The idea that faith can inspire people to move mountains, and that the individual quest for understanding the eternal is something that's common across cultures and time. We know that religious convictions can motivate people to undertake incredible acts of benevolence and care, while also religious dogma inspires people to undertake acts of terrorism. But for billions of people around the world, faith is not measured in prejudice and hate. It's measured in love and compassion for their fellow man, especially as we enter this holy season with Hanukkah and Christmas. So my core statement for our discussion tonight is this, that there will be no peace in our world without an understanding of the place of religion in it and a robust effort to protect the free practice. So tonight I'm going to talk about the global environment for faith, how it's changing, and share a bit about ways the United States is leading in this space. Now, as Judd mentioned, I am a native of Richmond, Kentucky. It's a great pleasure to be speaking to the World Affairs Council of Kentucky. I grew up there in Richmond. My parents were on faculty at Eastern Kentucky University for 30 years. And I went to Georgetown College and have been in the DC area now for 20 years, working in a variety of government capacities, focusing on how can the United States advance freedom of religion or belief for everyone everywhere. Most recently at the State Department in a special envoy role, where I worked for the Obama and the Trump administrations, trying to generate new movement to protect religious diversity and religious minorities in the Middle East and South and Central Asia. Now, as everyone knows, religion is everywhere. Religion is not a box you check, it's in every box. Spiritual life is at the center of every society around the globe. The Pew Forum for Religion and Public Life has done some fantastic work to sort of prove this, what we feel to be true. They found that 84% of the global community believes in God or a higher power. So that means 84% of humankind looks to a larger framework than themselves to give guidance and meaning to their life. And of that remaining 16%, many of those people still have belief structures. Maybe they're agnostic or atheistic, but they have a system of belief that guides their life. So the world is incredibly faithful. It's a very religious place, and it's an intrinsic part of the human experience. But while we're seeing increasing religiosity, we're also seeing increasing restrictions on the free practice of faith. Freedom of thought, frankly, is under assault around the world. Billions of people must daily confront challenges to the simple act of wanting to worship the way that their conscience leads. Now, this comes in a couple different forms. Laws and societal customs that can prevent individuals from exploring the big questions of life. We've seen how governments use Orwellian systems to prevent new ideas from challenging established thought systems, while non-state actors can use stigmatization, discrimination, or even violence to police their religious views. Turning again to the Pew Forum, they have another study on the global trends in the free practice of faith, and they just found about a month ago a 10-year increase in government restrictions on the free practice of religion or belief. And with that, they saw that almost 60%, almost 2/3 of the global community lives in countries with very high restrictions on the free practice of faith. Now, that doesn't mean everyone's being persecuted, but it does mean there are very narrow lanes of permissible religious activity, and lane changes aren't permitted. If you try to bust out of those lanes, try to believe in something different and act on those beliefs, you'll be in a world of hurt from governments or societal actors, or sometimes both. And in this context of COVID, everything's worse. All the existing conflicts have been exacerbated. We've seen an acceleration of instability in what were already fragile contexts. And governments have used COVID lockdowns as the justification for repression. And they've also used COVID as a way to stigmatize minority communities that are on the margins of their society. So with this increasing religiosity and increasing repression, we're seeing a dangerous mix of problems, of challenges for the global community, for the United States and our friends and partners. If we want to see a more peaceful and tolerant world, we've got to figure out a way to accommodate diversity of beliefs and ensure that people have the religious freedoms that are recognized in international law. So in this context, there's a vital role for the United States to play. And we've created a series of institutions and policies that really put the United States at the forefront of this challenge. But there's a lot of work to be done. Now, why does the United States do this? Well, part of it's a reflection of our values. Americans have always been interested in religious freedom, have always been interested in peacemaking. These are long-standing American ideals. So the first institution I want to point to is our own, the U.S. Institute of Peace. It's the country's only national, nonpartisan, and independent institute that is dedicated to ending violent conflict. USIP has this nice tagline that we believe a world without violence is possible, practical, and essential. We were created back in 1984 by Congress to really embody Americans' commitment to peacemaking by working internationally. And so we work as a nonpartisan partner with the different agencies of the US government, State Department, USAID, Defense Department, but also foreign governments, all in trying to develop strategies to promote peace. But we're not just inside the Beltway. We work in conflict zones. We have offices around the world in places like Iraq and Tunisia that work with communities and regional and national governments to come up with top-down and bottom-up solutions to these challenging problems. And then we bring that information back to Washington to create innovative training and education and importantly, policy recommendations for what we can do. And inside the House of USIP, we have a special team focused on religion and inclusive societies that's been operating for 25 years. And we work in that team to mainstream awareness of religion across diplomacy, development, and security by building partnerships with peacemakers, and also being sure to be inclusive of the voices that we bring to the table, so women and young religious leaders. And in that, we have a strong focus on promoting religious freedom in a holistic and nonpartisan way. So that's the USIP. The other structure I'd point out that really makes the United States a leader in this space is at the State Department. Back in 1998, Congress passed the International Religious Freedom Act that established the promotion of religious freedom as a foreign policy priority of the United States. It established a special office inside the State Department, the Office of International Religious Freedom, that's led by a special ambassador at large. And this came out of the important role that religious freedom has played for us domestically. We just celebrated Thanksgiving. We know that many of the first settlers came to the United States because they were fleeing religious persecution in Europe. And so the ability to practice religion, to pursue truth as your conscience leads, has been an important distinction, an important part of American exceptionalism that Congress wanted also enlivened in our diplomacy. So with this, we have the office, the ambassador at large, and some other special tools we'll talk about in a second. So with these big pillars of, or big challenges of rising persecution at a time with rising religiosity, what can the United States government do? It's a big problem. Well, I think there are three areas that we can pursue: understanding, engaging, and protecting. Understanding. So we need to make sure we understand the religious landscape of the countries that we're engaged with. We need to ensure that we see how religious life is lived by the populations. We need to understand the religious lens in which leaders view the world and view our actions. We need to educate ourselves. We need to increase our religious IQ so that our diplomats, our development agents, our service members who are abroad know the context of operating in and can be effective ambassadors for the United States and effective advocates for our foreign policy goals. And this is where USIP and the Religious Freedom Office of the State Department have done some groundbreaking work in starting to train U.S. government personnel on just the basics of religion, to give them that literacy that they need to be successful out in the field. But there's a lot more to be done. But we need to make sure that we're always mindful of the role of faith, that we see the religious landscape and understand how it applies to the execution of U.S. foreign policy, as we would with political issues and other concerns in a country. Secondly, we need to engage. That means we need to bring all the players to the table, not just political leaders, not just civic leaders, but also religious leaders. And amongst religious leaders, we can't feel like we've accomplished the job by having a bunch of old men with long beards and funny hats. Religious life is lived out in a community by a variety of actors. There's the traditional hierarchy and the priests and the imams and the religious leaders, but there's laity, there's women, there's youth. And this is a space where USIP has been very innovative to bring those voices to the forefront of important discussions. For example, in the context of Afghanistan, as we know, there's a big negotiation going on between the government of Afghanistan and the Taliban. USIP has had a special program to bring women of faith into those discussions and to give them the tools that they need so they can advocate for their concerns. And so much of that negotiation is about religion. The negotiations over whether to negotiate were stuck on how to interpret Islamic law. Who interprets Islamic law? What does it mean? And so part of USIP's program were to give these women the tools to engage in that discussion so that their voices can be heard. And then lastly, to protect. If we're going to engage religious actors, if we're going to ensure we hear all the voices from society, we need to make sure that there's a context of civic space for religious discussion so that these voices can be heard and not have to worry about jail or violence. As I mentioned, I've been in government, or I was in government for 20 years before joining USIP this summer. And I've seen the limits of government advocacy, which is often reactive, under-resourced, and inconsistently focused. But I've also seen the positive role that the United States can have. There are significant ways the United States can promote peace and interfaith understanding in conflict or fragile states. And in fact, if we're not doing it, it probably doesn't happen. The first is we identify the problem. The special office at the State Department issues a report every year on religious freedom conditions in every country of the world. And the bad guys hate it because here's the United States shining a light on their abuses of individuals for what they believe or don't believe. So it's an effective advocacy tool to highlight violations and to begin a conversation about reform. For countries that are still unwilling to right their wrongful ways, there's a special blacklist that countries can be added to add further diplomatic pressure to see that they reform. Secretary Pompeo just announced the most recent list of countries of particular concern yesterday. I'll read you the list, and it's a real rogues gallery. Burma, China, Eritrea, Iran, Nigeria, North Korea, Pakistan, Saudi Arabia, Tajikistan, and Turkmenistan. Now, this use of this blacklist is not something we ever want to do. In fact, I often say when a country is added to this list, it's a failure of diplomacy. We've been unsuccessful in moving a country to respect the rights of their citizens. But it also can be an effective way to create leverage, to create an incentive for a repressive government to change. And with this announcement, we saw that 2 countries were removed from these blacklists, Sudan and Uzbekistan. When I was at the State Department in this special office a year ago, we worked a lot with both Khartoum and Tashkent to encourage them to make the reforms. And the leadership did. They changed laws, they let people out of jail, they let churches meet, they let children attend mosques. It was important. And it was all because we had this tool to encourage reform that may not otherwise have happened. And then lastly, we want to work multilaterally in protecting. During the Trump administration, I worked with their leadership team to design the 2 summits that were convened in 2018 and 2019, focused on international religious freedom. We were able to bring together over 100 countries and 1,000 members of civil society from every faith community around the world. We made a point to be incredibly inclusive because we know that religious persecution impacts every community somewhere. We had Christians of every denomination, Muslims, Jews, Hindus, Sikhs, Baha'is, Yazidis, even members who are atheists, all have suffered because of their beliefs or identity. And we did that to build an alliance, a new movement to bring together like-minded countries to push back against China, to push back against Russia, those countries that are working to limit these freedoms so that we can create more space for freedom of belief. Now, as I start to wrap up, you may be thinking, well, why does this matter? Why should the United States care about these issues? Well, like I said earlier, it does reflect our values. I think we are a unique country. We're an exceptional country founded on the highest of ideals. And so we want to carry our values out into the world, conduct our diplomacy and our bilateral and multilateral relations. But it's also in our security interests. From our domestic experience, we know the benefits of allowing the free practice of faith. It's made us strong, it's made us vibrant, it's allowed us to incorporate the best ideas of all our citizens. We really believe religious freedom is a good thing, and that we've seen that environments protecting religious freedom are more peaceful and tolerant. We've also seen the opposite, that where there are religious freedom limitations, there's greater instability and you see the growth of violent extremism. So it's in our values and it's in our interest to be promoting religious freedom around the world. And lastly, while the United States shouldn't be the world's policeman, we can be a force for peace and for human rights. In fact, we are the leading voice for religious freedom advocacy and human rights advocacy, bar none. The amount of resources our country dedicates to promoting these human rights around the world, no country can compete with. And I've seen that when the United States steps forward, other countries come with us. And when we choose to step back, the response isn't nearly as robust. This is also at a time when China is increasingly vigorous in its diplomacy. It will threaten smaller countries. And so the role for the United States to be an advocate for these fundamental freedoms is needed now more than ever. So just a last thought, if you're looking for ways to get involved, first, I think come to USIP's website, usip.org, or follow us on Twitter @USIP. There's a wealth of information. You can see all the different ways that the Institute is engaged on promoting peace, both on religious issues and on broader topics. And while our mission is focused internationally, we do have a very unique charge to serve the American people directly by providing education and information on how conflicts can be resolved without violence. So we have actually a special public education team that carries this work forward across Kentucky and with schools around the country. I'm told that the Institute has engaged with over 30 schools across Kentucky, and has provided grants to several Kentucky institutions, including UK and U of L. And since I've joined USIP, I've helped make connections with professors at University of Louisville, Eastern Kentucky University Center, and I hope people don't mind, even University of Tennessee. So I hope you'll check out our website. You can also follow me on Twitter @Knox Thames to see how I'm speaking and commenting on these issues. But it's a great pleasure to be here. I want to thank Xiaojin Zhao for her leadership and Judd for hosting this, and I look forward to the discussion.
Thanks so much, Knox. I really appreciate the broad scope and bringing us into some focus. I've got several kind of questions that would love to be in dialogue with. And again, we will bring in your questions, so you can put those in the question and answer box. There's a couple there already, so we will get to those in just a minute. Knox, I wanted to get into the weeds a little bit about how we understand rights of religious groups. And specifically, how do we discern legally when the religious freedom breaks or another human right? So I think one of those balances is, when do we feel like a religious practice is no longer is not good for the common good? And when does legally, though, how do we understand religious freedom and religious practice and balancing that with basic human rights? What's kind of legal language around how we discern the difference between those? For example, a female genitalia mutilation, and we could see that as a religious practice in some communities. And how would we say, well, that breaks the human? And how do what's the language that we have around that to make those discerning questions?
That's a great question. And I'll start back by focusing on the international standards that we have looked towards to guide our work when I was at the State Department and in government, and now that I'm at USIP. Back in 1948, the Universal Declaration of Human Rights was created by the United Nations. It was a landmark document guided by Eleanor Roosevelt, working with a very diverse group of philosophers and legal scholars from around the world. And it was the first time that the international community stated that individuals have human rights. Up until then, it was sort of a debate, but the traditional view was that the states held the rights and that citizens were just sort of belonged to the state. But after the horrors of the Holocaust and the murder of millions of Jews, there was this new movement to say for the first time, no, people have rights, and that the states have the obligation to help protect those rights. So the Universal Declaration of Human Rights spells all this out in 20 plus different articles. Article 18 is the one on international religious freedom. And I think I'll read it just because it's very expansive and it helps explain the robust nature of this right and how it interlocks with other rights. It says, quote, everyone has the right to freedom of thought, conscience, and religion. This right includes the freedom to change religion or belief and freedom, either alone or in community with others and in public or private, to manifest religion or belief in teaching, practice, worship, and observance. So it's a very expansive definition. It includes theistic beliefs, polytheistic, atheistic, the right to believe in God or not, the right to go to worship, preach a sermon, share the word, change faith. The drafters under Mrs. Roosevelt's guidance were smart not to try to define religion. That would be an impossible thing. It's very, it's what's saintly to one is sinful to another. So they said that this is the right that every person has: freedom of conscience, freedom of thought, freedom of belief, and it's interconnected with other rights. I like to say that religious freedom is a bundled right, and that to be fully enjoyed, a host of other human rights also have to be enjoyed. So if you think about if you go to church on Sunday, synagogue on Saturday, mosque on Friday, or wherever you worship, there's a whole host of human rights that are exercised just by going to worship. First, there's freedom to believe. Have the belief system of your choice. Freedom of speech, the right to hear a sermon. Freedom of expression, to wear a distinctive dress like a hijab or a yarmulke. Freedom of movement, so you can just get to the place of worship on time. The idea of some sort of incorporated status, legal status, where a church can be a legal entity in its own right. So if someone falls and breaks their ankle on the ice, the priest isn't held personally liable, the institution can be held liable. And with that, property rights, that the community can come together and buy land to build a place of worship. So that's what makes it unique amongst the human rights system, and that it's this multifaceted composite right. And we've often said religious freedom is the canary in the coal mine for human rights. If there isn't religious freedom, then almost by definition, these other rights are in jeopardy. But a core principle of international law is one right can't be used against another right. So if someone would claim, well, our religion says that FGM is what we have to do to this young woman, even if she doesn't want it, well, that doesn't fly. That violates the whole premise of individual human rights. You see those, there are more complicated ones, but ones that involve physical harm, there are bright line questions, and you can never use international standard for religious freedom to justify something like that.
Thank you. Yeah, that's helpful. One of the, I'm going to bring the context a little bit closer to home. We recently have an issue in Kentucky whether the governor could require churches to not meet in person, or specifically religious churches, but religious institutions. How do we frame when a right like worshiping to gather in person is supersede, or the common good of Kentucky and the health of Kentucky would supersede religious freedom for the common good? Do we have some ways to understand that? And
that's clearly a burning question for all of us who want to get back to life as we knew it before COVID hit. I recently wrote an article for Christianity Today on this question of are these church closures for COVID persecution? And I'd seen a lot of discussion using that word, it's persecution. American Christians are being persecuted by these church closures. And I disagreed strongly. Persecution is violent. persecution is people being murdered for their faith. And I gave a list of experiences that I had personally engaged in that met the level of persecution. In the former Soviet Union, you have commandos raiding your church and arresting everyone, and there's no process to reopen it. It's just out of business. You see what's happening in China, the treatment of the Uyghur Muslims, the genocide of Rohingya Muslims in Burma, the general limitations across the Arab world for sort of independent forms of Christianity. That's persecution. Here in the United States, these closures, look, our church has been closed. I don't like it. I wish it was open. But it's temporary. It's at least in Virginia, where I live now, it's been measured. It's been, I think, justifiable, and it's not forever. And at the same time, here we have state officials in Virginia, at least, encouraging everyone to go to church online. So it's not like they're saying your church is closed, you don't have the right to worship. They're just saying, please don't do it there where the disease can spread. Do it at home for a limited duration of time. And with the vaccine now, first people got their shots today in the UK, I saw. So there's light at the end of this tunnel. I think there's worshipers need to be flexible during this unique moment and hold the common good front and center. I don't think, at least in the state, I don't know the Kentucky specifics, but at least in Virginia, the limitations haven't been done in a way that would violate religious freedom. But these are tough decisions. I mean, there is a balance. And I've seen other states like California, which seem to go pretty far the other way and be less rigorous in their justification.
Thank you. Yeah, that's helpful. So I do want to open it up now to some other questions. So feel free to put those in the chat, and we'll bring these questions in. The first question comes from Gloria Murray. Are there similar organizations in other countries, like the organization that you are a part of, that focus on similar things that you're talking about? Are there other countries that have similar types of organizations?
So on the idea of peace, it won't be a surprise that the Swiss government has a lot on focusing on how do you promote peace, being a neutral country and a home of the International Red Cross, Red Crescent. As far as religious freedom institutes, we're seeing a real growth. Over the last 5 years, we've seen a real expansion of the number of ambassadors that different countries have created to focus on religious freedom. Canada's had one, the UK's had one, the European Union's had one, Germany's had one, Norway has had one, Denmark has one. And that's a good thing. That means it's not the United States voice solely alone. Our voice is strong and uniquely influential, but when we bring others with us, we're even more effective. And now that there are a host of religious freedom ambassadors that can walk with us, we can share ideas, I think the issue is better for it.
Thank you. There's another question that asks, how can higher education professionals contribute to protecting religious freedom during a time of COVID? Higher education professionals. Do you have any thoughts or ideas on how educators can be involved in?
Yeah. I think this would be something that would be relevant before, during, or after COVID. Looking to educate students about, what is religious freedom? What is the history of it in our own country? How, in Virginia, we talk about it was Baptists who didn't want to pay the tax to the Episcopalian Church, which was the official church of the state of Virginia, and they went to Thomas Jefferson and he wrote the Virginia Statute of Religious Liberty, which was the precursor to the First Amendment. How many students know that? They appreciate this idea of openness and diversity of views, and then educate them about the world beyond the United States. We are an oasis for freedom. A bad day in the United States for religious freedom beats just about any other country in the world. So have them read these State Department reports, have them read different resources to give them the knowledge to understand the challenges that communities are facing around the world.
Thanks. There's a question that came from Facebook. Why is it that Muslims suffering in China getting as much attention in the US media? What has been the US Department of State's approach to the end of this suffering?
I think the State Department's been very forward-leaning on the persecution of Uyghur Muslims. For participants who may not know, they're sort of an ethnic and religious group in far western China. They're predominantly Muslim, and the Chinese government is out to get them. They've opened up re-education camps. They prohibit parents from naming their children Mohammed. Men can't grow beards. They force them to eat during Ramadan. And they're literally trying to squeeze the faith out of them. It's horrible. It's shocking. Like, we haven't seen stuff like this literally since, Stalin's gulags. And so the Trump administration has been very forward-leaning on this. The current ambassador at large for religious freedom, Sam Brownback, who was the governor of Kansas and I worked for, he's been very outspoken on the Uyghur situation. And I think there's an unnoticed trend of government persecution of Muslims globally. You have what's happening in China, you have what's happening in Burma, the Rohingya Muslims, another ethnic religious group that the government is out to get. It's almost a genocide. You have what's happening in India with a whole host of laws that are targeting their Muslim minority. Their Muslim minority of 180 million people. So India is actually the third largest Muslim country in the world. And then you see across the Arab world, there just isn't freedom of thought for Muslims. Like, they have to belong to what the state tells them to belong to, and if they challenge that, they'll go to jail or worse. So there's more work that I think everyone in the religious freedom space needs to do to recognize this global trend of persecution of Muslims. But China is by far and away right now the most aggressive.
Yeah, thank you. Another question is there another country besides the United States that really is a model for interfaith respect and rights? And what can we learn from them? Kind of a best practice question. What are some other countries that are doing that well, and can we learn something from them?
Our neighbors to the north, Canada, they are very good on these issues. They've been very strong allies of ours across administrations to promote freedom of religion or belief, to promote diversity. I think their focus on indigenous peoples, Native Americans, and Native Canadians rather, is, I think, something that could be emulated. The UK is strong on this. They're coming from a post-colonial context, and how do they integrate all these new communities that came from what were colonies that are now British citizens. So those are two that jump right to mind, but it's hard. There aren't a lot of good examples. There are more examples of doing it wrong than there are examples of doing it right. But those are two that we often would cooperate with closely.
Thank you. Another question. There's some hesitancy in public schools to even mention religion. Parents tend to object to such a discussion in a classroom. So how would a teacher integrate religion into the idea of civic education? Is that possible? We know that schools have really failed in preparing youngsters in the area of civics and understanding democracy. So does your organization have any ideas about helping teachers with this? After all, religious freedom is part of the ideals of our country.
Right. I just wrote an article for the USIP website, in fact, on the importance of teaching interfaith understanding and tolerance to students. So many of the problems we see with religious persecution abroad, when we're coming into with a diplomatic intervention, we're sort of dealing with a symptom and not the actual problem. Like, what led someone to feel that murdering other people was the right thing to do, or blowing themselves up was the right thing to do, or arresting people was the right thing to do? A lot of it has to go back to an education system that doesn't teach students to appreciate diversity, to respect the human rights of their fellow citizens, that doesn't prepare them to live in an increasingly diverse world, religiously, ethnically. And so I was putting out some ideas about how we, the United States and the broader international community, try to get upstream of these human rights abuses by starting to find ways to encourage the teaching of tolerance and human rights, as that children would be prepared to be good global citizens, and they would come out of a positive classroom environment with good student outcomes, and they would they'd be literate about, a basic understanding of world religions, but also how, even if you believe in something different than I do, I don't have to agree with that, but I respect your right to hold that belief, and we can still be friends. We can still be devoted towards a common cause of our country. And if we're going to get ahead of all the violations that we're seeing, I think education is a key part that so far we've really failed to emphasize.
And just to let you know, locally, those of you that are from Louisville, the school system just recently came out with some new guidelines for teachers on how to celebrate religious holidays. Interfaith Paths to Peace is going to be putting a link to that document up and sharing it on Facebook. Monica Laquani with the JCPS school system has recently worked on that, and they're resending that out this week to teachers to help them understand the difference between religious celebrating and educating us on religious practice. So be looking for that on the IPP webpage. We'll also share that with the World Affairs Council webpage, so you can have some information as a teacher on how to do that. Another question, if more countries are doing it wrong instead of right, how can we change that behavior as individuals and as the United States? Yeah, that's a really good question.
Yeah, that's the $1 million question. I think, what can we do as individual citizens? You and I can't go talk to the Chinese premier, but we can ask our elected officials to care. We can ask our congressmen and our senators, let them know that we're concerned about religious persecution, and we want them to be advocates for everybody. I think, I've been in this space a long time, and you see a lot of people coming to this work because of concerns about their people of their own faith. And that's a good thing. We need more people to be speaking up. But I do believe that the best way to see gains for a particular faith community is to advocate for religious freedom for everyone. That in an environment where everybody has freedom of thought, freedom of conscience, that's going to be an environment where every religious community is going to thrive. And so when we go to our elected leaders, it's, please speak up for the persecuted Christians. Please speak up for the persecuted Muslims. And please advocate for religious freedom. Give our government the resources and, frankly, apply political pressure to make sure they care about this. They get higher up the talking points. Internationally, I think the United States, we have to make sure human rights are part of consequential diplomacy. Too often, 20 years ago, we could name and shame. We could just shine a light, and that would actually be a quite effective tool to see reforms made. That's still a good tool. It's still a tool in the toolbox. Countries don't like the attention, but we're now seeing with countries like China, like Russia, that they're more impervious to being embarrassed. And so we have to create consequences. So what is that going to mean for China? Like, are we going to maintain a trade relationship with a country that's a gross violator of human rights? I don't think we should. I think there should be consequences for violating these human rights. If we say we care about human rights, if we say this is a reflection of our values, then we need to make sure that we really mean it, or we're just going to be hypocrites. And I think that's the struggle with diplomacy. It's balancing. You've got trade-offs. There's a country like Saudi Arabia that's so important for energy and Middle East security. There are no churches in Saudi Arabia, although there are millions of Christians there. They jail Shia. There's a women's rights activist who's on trial in an anti-terrorism court because she wanted the right to drive. Our relationship with the Saudis should be substantially impacted because of these human rights concerns. But it's, like I said, diplomacy is a tough business.
Yeah, thank you for. Thank you. Yes, and I think one of the concerns, at least that I have, is when does prioritizing religious freedom versus the economic, sometimes we don't speak out against abuses of religious freedom or abuses of people because of economic reasons. And that's related to the question of how does the US prioritize religious rights with other foreign policy concerns? Like, where do you sense that ranks in those concerns?
With the Trump administration, they elevated religious freedom in unprecedented ways. The holding of these two summits had never happened before anywhere. And so they deserve credit for that. At the same time, I was concerned about the basic ending of the refugee program, which is incredibly important when you're working to advance human rights. It takes years to see reforms implemented. So how do we rescue the people who are literally running for their lives today? And the refugee program is an important way to provide aid. And so I was pleased that President-elect Biden indicated he was going to increase the numbers substantially. And I hope he will maintain this priority of religious freedom. Of course, they're going to have a reprioritization of foreign policy. That's their right. He's indicated an interest in democracy promotion and climate change. But there was an interesting report by E.J. Dionne and Melissa Rogers, who are two sort of leading thought leaders in the Democratic circles in Washington. And we're making the case for why the Biden administration should maintain this robust engagement on religious freedom. This doesn't need to be a Republican or Democratic issue. It's an American issue. It's not bipartisan. It's nonpartisan. So I'm hopeful that this issue will stay high up the list. There's all the arguments I said earlier about it reflects our values. It's in our interests. We'll see. Tony Blinken, who's been identified to be the Secretary of State for Mr. Biden, I worked with him some in the Obama administration. He's a human rights guy. I was excited to hear his name mentioned. He spoke at a conference I've initiated at the State Department in July 2016 on religious minorities in Iraq. He was an advocate for calling ISIS atrocities against Yazidis and Christians a genocide. So I think we'll have someone who cares about this topic atop our diplomatic pyramid.
Yeah, and that was one of the questions you may have already answered. Do you see any changes with the new Biden administration on the focus of those kinds of priorities?
Yeah, I hope they'll continue. I mean, by law, they have to. It's Congress says this is a priority, but it's also how high or how far down the list it goes. I do think the Biden administration will have a greater emphasis on religious engagement, equipping our diplomats to see that religious landscape. There was a special office during the Obama administration at the State Department that was focused on just being the front door for people of faith. So, how do we engage religious actors on, preventing childhood disease? Well, they can be incredibly effective ambassadors for that, but our diplomats aren't sure how to do it. So we had this special office that would create those kinds of openings, climate change, better education systems, clean water. I feel pretty confident that office will be resurrected and brought back up, and I think that'll be a good thing.
And for those of you that are local, I want to remind you that a practical thing you can do, the intersection of our immigrant refugee population and Louisville's religious diversity are almost synonymous. We are getting religious diversity primarily through our immigrant and refugee program. And as many of you know, Louisville has one of the most outstanding many organizations in Louisville. And one of the ways you can promote and be engaged in religious freedom is building relationships with our local diaspora. Build relationships with these immigrants and refugees because they are engaged in human rights issues back in their country of origin. So we don't necessarily have to go through international organizations to support those rights. You can turn to your local diaspora and be involved in relationship with them because they are in relationship with their communities of practice back home. And so that's a great way to engage locally, but also have a global resource. So this is the last question. I think that we got, and maybe that was, yeah, I think that was the last question. So in kind of final thought, Any kind of words that you would leave? I really appreciated that you left us with 3 or 4 challenges. Could you reiterate those challenges for things, real practical things that we could do? I thought that was very helpful.
Well, first, I love your idea about engaging with the local refugee community. My first job out of college was doing refugee resettlement in Atlanta. I joined AmeriCorps, moved down to Atlanta, and growing up in Kentucky in the 80s and 90s, I look at the census data. And at that time, Kentucky was the second most homogeneous state in the country, second to like New Hampshire. So there just wasn't a lot of diversity growing up. And so going down to Atlanta and knowing people who had been persecuted because of what they believed or their ethnicity was really a powerful experience. And you realize these folks are heroes, like what they went through to protect their families, running for their lives in the middle of the night, living in refugee camps years, and then coming to this new country, this new world, and starting over and becoming very productive Americans is a beautiful thing. And so I think that was a great suggestion for those who are in the Louisville area to get to know your local refugee community. It'll be worth it. Practically, I think let your elected officials know that religious freedom matters to you, religious freedom for everybody. So much of Washington operates on pressure that elected officials feel from constituents. And so if they're not hearing from you that this matters, they may not be very outspoken on it. Some members, this is their issue. This is why they got involved in politics. Others, not so much. And so it's important that if you care about this, that you're focused on it with them. On the bigger issues of the 3 topics I focus on: understand, engage, and protect. How do we educate ourselves about the religious landscape in countries that are interesting? I think that's something where we need to do more as a country to train our diplomats. How do we engage inclusively so that all the voices are at the table, not just the traditional religious leaders, but there are other voices, and we need to be proactive in bringing them alongside so their voices can be heard, and then protecting. And that gets back to the United States remaining a leader in this space. As an expression of our values and our interests. And like I said, no other country can do what we can do. And I've, over my career, I've met victims of persecution, I've met survivors, and, they pray for the United States to come help them. They literally pray that we will come and speak up for them. And I think it's important that people locked away in some godforsaken jail for believing in the wrong thing know the United States is advocating. And I think it's also important that the persecutors know that the United States is going to do everything that we can to push back, that, fundamental human rights are something that are at the top of our agenda. And if you want to be friends with us, well, then you got to treat your people better. And that's good human rights policy. That's good long-term policy. I think it's the best reflection of what it means to be as Americans.
Well, Knox, again, from me personally and Interfaith Path to Peace, thanks so much for this work you're doing. We have seen over the last year kind of an isolating of our concerns because of understandable because of COVID and recent racial injustice that's continues to come to light. And I hope that as we begin to get our own house and really will turn outwardly. I think we've been pretty inwardly focused, and I would hate for that to be a trend because there are so many ways we need to be leaders just around the world and with human rights, religious rights. And thank you for the work that you're doing in that area, and we will continue to support you. And thanks again to the World Affairs Council for sponsoring this in our local community. We'll turn it back over to you all. Thanks.
Thank you, John and Knox, and for that really thoughtful conversation. I think, religion is always one of those very hot topics that gets people really thinking about the values that we hold important, and its place in foreign policy, which is what Knox has addressed, and then also its place in the local community, which Judd has really brought out for this conversation. So thank you both for that. And Knox, I'm sorry we can't bring you in person. You would have loved it because I think we are much more diverse than when you left. We have, I believe, over 130 plus languages spoken in our public schools now. We are one of the largest resettlement states in the US. So it's a lot more diverse here. And so these issues are certainly much more relevant and timely for us. So I want to thank you both for the work that you do and continue promoting that those very important values in just in our communities, also around the world. And I also want to thank all of our attendees tonight for posing your great questions and your thoughts, and the World Affairs Councils of America and the U.S. Institute of Peace for supporting this program and offering these kinds of important conversations across the U.S. There will be others. So for those of you who are joining us from various parts of the U.S., stay tuned for those opportunities. There will be other conversations. And before we conclude, I just want to do a quick reminder that next Thursday at noon, we will host a conversation with the founders of Anchal, ANCHAL, which is a Louisville-based nonprofit social enterprise that addresses the exploitation of women around the world by using design thinking to create employment opportunities, products, and markets that support empowerment. So I hope everybody who's on this call will bookmark our website, worldkentucky.org, and stay updated with all of our weekly programs. And again, I want to thank all of you for joining us this evening. I hope you will stay safe and healthy during the season, and we look forward to seeing you all again next time. So good night, everybody. Thank you.